So I'm going to leave proprioception for a moment and move on to the vestibular sense. And I'm going to start with two quotes from the American Charge Syndrome book. I wrote a small chapter about vestibular issues and their implications in 2010, I think, or 2011. And these are my two quotes. First of all the many sensory impairments associated with Charge syndrome, absence of or significant damage to the vestibular sense is perhaps the most far-reaching in its implications, the least understood, and the most overlooked. I think it's crucially important. And then at the end of my chapter, I say this: in the future, it's likely that we will discover close links between significant vestibular impairment and many of the currently unexplained charge behavioral features, such as difficulty with the self-regulation of arousal levels, sudden and apparently unpredictable mood changes, poor memory, and executive dysfunction. And I still stand by that. In fact, I now feel much more strongly that what I say in those quotes is very true. This is a diagram of the vestibular apparatus. It actually shows everything that we should see in the inner ear on both sides of the head. And I've included it just to give you a graphic idea of the vestibular apparatus. At the top, you have the cochlea, like a snail shell, the organ of hearing, and everything below that is the vestibular apparatus. It's all very small, very delicate. It's all made of hollow objects. There are two bulbs and then three curved pipes, the semicircular canals. And altogether, those create the vestibular apparatus. As I said, they're all hollow, they're all filled with fluid, and the inside of them is lined with nerve hairs, which are moved when the fluid in them moves. And of course, the fluid moves in response to head movement. And the vestibular sense tells us about head position and head movements. This is the sense, more than anything else, that tells us where our head is and what our head is doing and what position our head is in. And all that information is conveyed very rapidly. Any head movement, the movement of that fluid sends messages through the cranial nerves to our brain very, very quickly. So we know exactly where our head is, what it's doing, and how quickly or how slowly it's doing it and moving. It's a fascinating system, and it also has other implications. I think people forget how extensive this sensory system is. I'll go on to those things in a moment. But first, I want to talk about the causes of vestibular disorder. It's quite an extensive list. And in Charge syndrome, it's mainly a problem because the vestibular apparatus did not develop properly during gestation. While the fetus was forming in the womb, that apparatus didn't develop effectively. And we know if the child has a scan of the inner ear, it can show that the apparatus is malformed, particularly the semicircular canals, which might be missing, or they might be rudimentary. Parts of them will have formed, but the rest will be missing. But it's interesting that it is possible for children who clearly have significant vestibular dysfunction to have a scan of the inner ear that shows all of the vestibular apparatus is present and correct. Unfortunately, the scan shows that anatomically it looks present and correct. It doesn't show that neurologically it's connected. It doesn't show that it's plugged in, if you like. And I think we need to be aware of that as a potential problem, because I know many parents of children who clearly have significant vestibular dysfunction who've had a scan of the inner ear and they've been told the vestibular system is fine. And that is not the correct way of phrasing it. And those parents, of course, come away very confused because they then look for a different reason why their child has these particular issues and particular problems. And it's rather like the way ophthalmologists sometimes look at a child's eyes, a child with Charge's eyes, and they say, oh, vision is fine. And the child clearly doesn't have normal functional vision. That's not a helpful way of reporting on clinical findings. It's misleading and it's partial information. And I'd like parents to be well aware of that if they get this rather conflicting information from clinical evaluations. Jean Ayres, who's the occupational therapist who created sensory integration theory and sensory integration therapy, she told us that the vestibular system is the unifying system. All other types of sensation coming in through our other senses are processed in reference to this basic vestibular information. The activity in the vestibular system provides a framework for the other aspects of our experiences. In other words, of all those senses, this is the big one. This is the foundation on which all our other sensory systems can develop and work effectively if they're not damaged or impaired in some way. So this really is a sensory system that needs to be assessed and that we need to address very early in the child's life and the child's development. And I really regret when I go back to the 1980s that I didn't know this kind of thing. And I didn't know it as well as I do now with those many babies and toddlers that I worked with in London who were showing clear evidence of vestibular dysfunction. We've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. The sensory system itself covers an enormous range of implications if it goes wrong. And I have a list. If there are vestibular issues, the organization of all sensory information is likely to be affected negatively. Postural security and muscle tone will be affected. There will be lots of postural anxiety, and muscle tone will tend to be very low, with the child preferring to minimize the risk of gravity. In other words, by laying down, by getting the head supported, by propping and looking for as much physical support as they can get. They're not being lazy. They're trying to compensate for significant vestibular dysfunction. It has implications for the use of residual vision, and I'll say more about that in a moment. It also has implications for the perception and the processing of sound input, not just vision, but sound as well. If the vestibular system isn't working well, there are implications for remembering auditory sequences and remembering movement sequences. There are implications for memory development, especially short-term memory. There are implications, therefore, for speech and language development, implications for all sorts of behavioral developments and behavioral challenges, implications for the good development of bilateral coordination, developing good left and right coordination, and being able to do things like cross the imaginary midline in order to use, say, your right hand to do things on the left side of the body, that is likely to be missing or slow developing with significant vestibular dysfunction. There are also implications for breathing, feeding, digestion, and nutrition because of all these other issues. There are big implications for fatigue and energy levels. Dealing with vestibular dysfunction is a very demanding, tiring thing to do. And we need to be aware of that and allow for it. And last of all, the vestibular sense is the most important sense in helping children develop good self-regulation. And we know that self-regulation can be very poorly developed in a significant number of people with charge syndrome, going from early infancy right through to adulthood and older adulthood. We're now seeing an older and older population with charge, and it's giving us the opportunity to see what kind of late onset difficulties might we come across. And it's interesting how much self-regulation can continue to be a challenge for adults with charge, even if it's not so overwhelming a challenge as it was when they were teenagers or 8 years old or 5 years old or even 2 years old. So this is a sensory system with huge implications for development and huge implications if it goes wrong. I've written in the charge edition of the American Journal of Medical Genetics, which came out in 2005, I wrote a piece about the effects of poor or missing vestibular function in young children with charge syndrome. And that will be available to you in your resources. And it's interesting. Some of the things I mention, low muscle tone, poor head control and poor ability to resist gravity, strong postural insecurity if you hold them upright, a marked preference for being flat on the back, delayed mobility with unusual movement patterns, especially back scooting, going head first on the back, sidewinding like a snake, or getting in the crawl position with the head on the floor and doing the 5-point crawl, either forwards or backwards, all very common in young children with charge syndrome. The children often see, hear, and use their hands better if they're on their backs or lying on their side than if they're sitting up, because the brain is no longer focusing on, am I safe? Am I going to fall over? Poor bilateral coordination, major issues with fatigue, and difficulties with self-regulation. And as the physiotherapist at Perkins School for the Blind in Massachusetts said on one occasion, for children with charge syndrome, gravity sucks. It sucks quite literally in pulling them down to earth in ways that they find challenging, but it also sucks in that it's a huge nuisance and a huge preoccupation for them. Early mobility, I mentioned sidewinding and back scooting and the 5-point crawl. We also see rolling, and we also see regular crawling in some children, which is quite remarkable. Developing walking is a challenge, and we know that young children with charge usually walk quite late. There are various statistics available to suggest the mean age. Sometimes people say it's about the age of 3, sometimes the age of 4. But we know children who didn't walk till they were 10, 11, or 12. But we also know children who walked at 18 months to 2 years. So it's a very wide spectrum, like so many things in charge. There's a diagram I have called the equilibrium triad, which shows that the vestibular system, the proprioceptive system, and vision all work together to get us upright and with good balance. And that's good to remember when you're trying to encourage the development of balance in a child with charge, that vision plays a big part, and so does touch and proprioception, as well as the vestibular sense, which is often called the balance sense, though actually it isn't the balance sense, because that would involve proprioception and vision. And Jean Ayres, the OT again, she gave us a marvelous quote. She said, "After air to breathe, postural security is our next most urgent priority." After air to breathe, postural security is our next most urgent priority. In other words, if the child doesn't feel that their body is safe, if they don't know that they're okay and they're not going to fall and they're not going to hurt themselves, their brain will not focus on anything else until they get that confirmation. And we need to provide that confirmation for them if they're not able to do it for themselves, by administering deep pressure or some movement, some rocking, some bouncing, some deep pressure massage, the kinds of things that are going to give their brain better contact with their body. I talk in the American Journal of Medical Genetics. I say children often adopt specific postures. For example, getting horizontal with both legs bent, one ankle up, crossing the other knee, fingers crossed or bunched together in a fist, arms folded. These kinds of postures provide essential extra touch and pressure information to the brain about where the child's limbs are in space. And it also confirms for them that they're securely fixed and not floating around and not likely to fall. And while these behaviors have always been present, they seem to have been unnoticed to a large extent. And I think it's good to remember that the brain is only connected to the body through the senses, the conscious and the unconscious brain. I know it's lodged in the head, but without the senses, the brain has no idea where it is, what the body is doing, where the body is, and what the body needs to do, or what the body has just done, because there's no feedback coming into the brain to provide all that information. And I think most children with charge syndrome are not in touch with their bodies very well, or they don't feel their bodies very well. And I've got a selection of photographs of these kind of postures we see, which are partly to exaggerate sensory information, to get the brain in better contact with the body, and partly to bring arousal levels down, to reduce anxiety, to calm the children, and to increase the availability of their brain for other things rather than thinking, where's my body? One very important connection with the vestibular system is the visual sense. And there is a reflex called the vestibulo-ocular reflex, or VOR. It's quite complicated to explain. And usually when I'm talking about this, I'm on a platform and I move around and bend and stretch and things. But basically, I have a clinical description, which I will explain in ordinary English. It says, in normal head movement, the eyes move in the opposite direction of the head and at the same speed to stabilize the retinal image. In other words, if I look at you and I look directly in your eyes and I make eye contact, I can do that. I'm blind in one eye, but I have good vision in the other eye. I can make eye contact. Then I can bend right down, or I can stand right up. I can swing to my left. I can swing to my right. I can go round in a circle, and I can maintain the eye contact, even though my eyes are moving all over the place. And it's my vestibular sense that enables me to keep the eye contact, not my visual sense. My visual sense enables me to make the eye contact and locate your eyes. But then the ability to move my eyes, maybe at speed, great speed, and still look at you in the eyes. It's my vestibular. So as my head moves, the vestibular apparatus sends messages very quickly through the cranial nerves to my brain saying the eyes are going down, so they need to move up in the eye sockets. Now the eyes are going up, so they need to turn down. Now the eyes are going to the left, so they need to turn right. And that way I can maintain the eye contact. If my vestibular system wasn't working, first of all, I would probably fall over. But assuming I'm in a chair, if it stopped working and I moved my head, my eyes would go with my head and I would lose you and I would have to look for you again. And when we look at children's postural behaviors, when they're looking at things, when they're using the iPad, when they're looking at a book, when they're watching somebody sign a communication to them, very often they fix the head and they fix the body to fix the head, to fix the eyes, so that they can use vision in the best, most reliable and most comfortable way possible. And we see that over and over again in all kinds of situations from the children. All the postures I've shown and talked about, if we think about why do children do them, I think locating the body, especially answering that question, where is my head, is a really important one. They do it to confirm they've got postural security or to obtain postural security. They do it to stabilize the body, to stabilize the head, to stabilize the eyes for visual tasks. Sometimes they will do the stretching, strong backward extension, in order to ease the pain and the discomfort of chronic constipation. Or they may go into extension to open up the airway if they're having breathing difficulties. And also, they adopt these postures largely in order to self-regulate themselves, to calm themselves down, or increase their confidence for better functioning.